Cappelli took his time early in the morning before he has a conference to join us. And he's really one of the most outspoken and prominent thought leaders in the field of human resource management and labor economics. He is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management, and I just have to say, for those who are very unknowing, has nothing to do with Frederick Taylor, as we will see later, but that was what was an important general, so just to get that a little bit off the chest, at Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Human Resources, so here we are really with proper human resources. Your extensive career was focused on workforce management, talent. I read a lot about talent development on your side, or talent, and the intersection between corporate strategies and employee engagement. So Peter is a globally recognized scholar. Groundbreaking research has shaped how organizations think about managing talent, that at least I would claim, from hiring practices to employee development. And he also advised companies and governments on employment policies and workforce issues, and regularly appeared in business outlets such as Harvard Business Review. So I guess a lot of people have read your articles there, or also the Wall Street Journal. And then, of course, for me as a scholar, also in journals like the Academy of Management Review. So his newest book, what you're going to talk about to us quite soon, is called Our Least Important Assets: Why the Relentless Focus on Finance and Accounting is Bad for Business and Employees. So I guess we're going to hear a lot about making also accounting much better. It needs to shape up. And here you challenge contemporary approaches to managing people. And in the book, you critique how financial accounting frameworks treat labor as a liability, drive business towards harmful cost cutting or headcount that undermines long-term success, among other things. And you argue for a radical shift where employees are valued as critical assets, again, I would say, rather than as costs to be minimized. So I'm really very much looking forward to your presentation. And as I said, I might have leave out some things which are important to you. So please, if you want to share more than what I've said, please do so.
Okay, over to me. Good. Thank you, Antoinette. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the project that you folks are working on. And I should say my talk is very much US focused. And I think what I'm describing is reasonably common across Commonwealth countries, but not so much elsewhere. And I would say the kinds of issues that you folks are raising, which I think are broadly philosophical kinds of questions, we seem to take most of that for granted in the US. It is worth noting, maybe on an optimistic note, that the shareholder value idea, which is creating lots of issues, is entirely an ideological debate, right? There was nothing in legislation that created shareholder value notion. It was entirely an argument that largely came out of business schools and the rise of financial economics and the courses that in economics that assumed that the point of companies was to maximize shareholder value became kind of pervasive. But it is quite a difficult thing to dislodge here in the US. And just to give you a little example of that, the stories you may have heard at my university, University of Pennsylvania, and by the way, Frederick Taylor did teach at the Wharton School,
Okay.
although I am not the Frederick Taylor professor. The pushback, the arguments that you probably have heard about the Palestinian crisis and the disputes on campus and the quite strong pushback from alumni um, was only partially about the Palestinian story, that it was a larger pushback on ideological grounds against a range of issues. Diversity inclusion is one of them, but ESG issues as well. And, you know, maybe the biggest concern in the US now is politically is, I think, recognized the ability of the extremely wealthy to throw an entire debate with a small proportion of their money. And you may have seen the New York Times story this morning. Three billionaires have just given Donald Trump $220 million this month, right? One of our alumni in the New York Times at Wharton announced that he was going to give Wharton $100 million, but decided that we were off on a crazy diversity inclusion agenda, and so he gave it to the University of Chicago. So the power of a few individuals to throw the agenda is really quite remarkable here. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about are some of the things which are restraining, you might say, the ability to flourish. And my concern was even simpler than that, though. It was they're just getting in the way of sensible management, even if your goal was simply to maximize profits. It's a little weird to see this, and I think you'll see how weird it seems in just a minute. I should say that speaking of weird capitalism, I am in the second strangest city in the United States at the moment, and that is Orlando, which is a part of Florida, which is basically an entire corporate community that I'm in here, created by the Marriott Corporation. And I was yesterday in the strangest city in the US, which is Las Vegas. And you know, these are entire communities created by businesses. It's really quite a weird thing. So I started writing this book with a different kind of agenda, and the agenda was to just explain how when you read textbooks of human resources, and then you looked at the reality of how things worked, they were just unbelievably different, that the textbooks were still rooted in a 1950s model of big corporations and lifetime employment. And you know, if you looked at things like hiring practices, textbooks would describe how you craft a job description, and then you post the ad and you see who applies, and then you apply interviews and various selection tests and all this kind of stuff. And the reality in the US is the average person who changed employers last year reported they weren't even looking for a job. Somebody came and got them. And they don't do any of those selection tests anymore. Almost nobody does. It just doesn't look like the reality. So I started to write a book about that. And then along the way, I sort of discovered that there was a common theme when you were looking at contemporary ways of managing employees that looked a little like the textbooks, but not much. But the common theme was that they had all been stripped down of any of the costs that were also the things that kind of made them work. Now, the second part of that finding was that a lot of the practices you might think of in the US, we would call these high road practices. And these are ones consistent with flourishing, which basically high investment in employees, treating them as assets. The Douglas McGregor phrase from the late 1950s, theory X versus theory Y, still applies very much. Theory Y was this idea of taking employees seriously as having human needs and interests, and the theory X is Frederick Taylor kind of view that they are widgets and respond to rewards and punishments. That's it. The high road practices, despite years of evidence, which keeps accumulating, just are in retreat and have been kind of for a while. And related to that is the fact that jobs, at the very least, are not getting better in the US, despite the fact the economy is really doing remarkably well and the stock market is booming, wages are stagnant, stress levels are increasingly high, and we're seeing the current priority, despite a very tight labor market, as being cutting, downsizing, and trying to operate leaner and leaner. So why is that going on, right? So the thing that puzzled me when I started to look at this is that the practices we're seeing not only are not good for flourishing, they're just don't even make business sense. They're not efficient practices. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. And here are just some descriptive things about how management in the US is working. Let me focus a little bit on performance appraisals, which is close to the kind of issue of development. Historically, performance appraisals, like a lot of these practices, are US inventions, and like a lot of the US inventions, they actually came out of the US military in the beginning of the Second World War when they were trying to figure out who should be promoted to officer ranks when the Army was exploding in size for the Second World War. And after the Army, when they went to the corporate world, this may surprise you, but performance appraisals were entirely designed to think about employee development. That was the entire purpose of them. They shifted radically over time for ideological reasons, I would say largely, and that is to think that the goal of performance appraisals was to hold people accountable for past performance, that it was part of a incentive compensation view of management. And we started to see a pushback of that in the 2010s, and my colleague Anna Tavis and I were part of that pushback, and the recognition that the way we were managing performance with a once at the end of the year kind of settling up exercise was terrible. Everybody knew it was terrible. Everybody hated it. They did it simply because the CFOs required it as part of the budget cycle when you're giving people merit pay. But it was ideological. People at the top thought it was important to hold people accountable for their pay increases, even though the pay increases were trivial and hardly varied. And there was a serious effort. About a third of companies gave that up. And they moved toward a model, or they were moving toward a model of continuous conversations with employees to focus on improvement, which is quite a radical departure. And all the consulting companies moved in this direction, and many big corporations, General Electric among them, and IBM, were moving in this direction. It seems to have all fallen away, and that now I would say most companies are either gone back to something like a very simple appraisal process, tick the box thing, some of them doing it 4 times a year rather than once a year. But a lot of companies just doing nothing. I mean, no performance appraisal, no nothing. I mean, it's quite amazing why this is happening. One of the other puzzling things about human resources now is the extent to which we have pushed so much of it out of the companies and the employers onto vendors. And it's astonishing the size of this industry. So one of my colleagues, former student, and I totaled this up this year. And if you want to see it, it's in the Human Resource Management Journal. And the size of this industry is $1.9 trillion. And that is roughly the size of the Italian economy, or at least the official Italian economy, right? So it's quite an enormous industry, and they spend 10% of their money on marketing. And this is where we see all these silly fads coming along, right? They're generated by this industry, which is creating problems because they're selling you solutions to them. So what are we talking about? These generational difference stories, for example, for which there's no evidence whatsoever. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences debunked the whole idea, and yet you still see it percolating along. You know, the idea we keep hearing about skill shortages and somehow there's something wrong with the workforce. These are all generated by the industry of vendors, which are pushing problems because they're selling you solutions. It's a real issue for research because the vendors have basically control the agenda for human resources and ultimately for research. Career advancement just doesn't really exist anymore. We don't promote from within much at all. It used to be 90% of people promoted from within or positions filled internally. Now that's down to, depending on your measure, 10 to 20% are filled internally, which means you're just constantly hiring from the outside. That means the average tenure at US employers now is only 4 years. The average 50-year-old has had 12 different employers in the US already. You often hear people in the US say kids today are job hoppers. It's not just kids, it's everybody. And that's partly because of layoffs that push people out, and then we don't fill vacancies from within. Here's the most remarkable one. This company ADP, one of those huge vendors, which does the payroll for 80 million people in the US, did a quick calculation and found that when they looked at people who had been promoted, which they can measure pretty easily, Within 1 month, 29% of those people who were promoted quit. Now, think about how bizarre that is, right? If you're an employer, you've just promoted somebody, so they must be among your better performers. And you discover that within 1 month, almost a third of them are gone. Now, why on earth would that possibly happen? Well, here's one reason, because they've started promoting people and not giving them pay increases. And why would that possibly be? Because somebody in management believes that the promotion should be enough of a reward. I mean, it's insanely dumb, right? Because what you've done, you've promoted somebody to a higher job title where their market value is now higher, and you haven't paid them for it. So now you're dramatically underpaying them, and it doesn't take them long to figure out that they're way more valuable elsewhere, so they leave. How could this possibly make any sense for the organization, right? Training, and I heard Antoinette talking about this a few minutes earlier. There's sort of no training going on in US companies now. The most astonishing one is 39% of managers say they had no training before becoming a manager. Why is it surprising they don't know what they're doing? Why is it surprising that frontline supervisors are not able to engage their employees? They have no idea how to do it. And back to the hiring issue here, another astonishing thing. If you are just interested in efficiency, that US employers are not looking at the quality of people they hire. They're not measuring that. They measure costs per hire. They don't measure whether they're getting good people or not. I mean, it's just bizarre, right? So when you start looking at these things, you say, what on earth is possibly going on? This doesn't make any sense. Forget about helping employees or thriving. Just if you're trying to make money, this just not seem to make any sense. So why is it happening? A couple of other things too that are going on. One is the big shift away from employees to non-employee workers. And this does not mean contractors. You know, the gig economy thing is another kind of myth. It's not that big in the US. The people who are really gig workers, who are contractors, percentage of the population has gone up only trivially in recent years. The big change has been the move toward leased employees. These are people who actually work for a big employer staffing firm like Randstad or in the US Manpower, and they are on your site. They are actually the employees of Randstad, right? And why is this happening? It's not cheaper. It's actually more expensive per unit of work. Why is that going on? This is just shows you the array of ways in which vendors can get you people who are not currently your employees. I mean, it's an enormous industry. This industry on its own is $250 billion, right? I mean, it's just enormous. Here's another story you probably have heard from the US, something else we've created from the tech industry called unlimited vacations. And this means just take whatever time off you want, right? As opposed to the older model where you earned time off, and you would get not much compared to Europe, but you get some time off that the employer kind of owes to you. Why did they move to this notion of unlimited vacations? It seems crazy from the employer's perspective. Well, you'll see the answer to that in just a minute. Of course, it has nothing to do with helping employees, right? And we've seen this steady erosion of what appeared to be enormous progress in understanding the theory Y view of management, right? And you can see these developments first with quality circles in the 1970s. They really worked to engage employees. The discovery that automation was not better than carefully managed employees, that lean production, the Japanese approach, bitterly resisted by US auto companies, I think European ones too, was just wildly superior to anything we were doing here. Lean production at its heart is about engaging frontline workers in solving problems. There was a movement on the service side at our colleagues at Harvard Business School in the 1990s, recognizing that in service jobs, people are the product, and that if you treat your frontline employees well, sales and everything about output improves, widely sort of accepted at the time. The Agile manifesto in the 2010s seemed to be everywhere, and I'm sure you started to hear this too. And that was an idea of further empowering employees by basically not only giving them control over productivity issues, but giving them control over even the agenda. What is it we should be producing here, and how do we do it? It was just way, way more productive, way more efficient. It's all got pulled back. And this is, as far as I can see, largely ideological, but to some extent, accounting reasons, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Shareholder value doesn't tell you anything about what to do, right? It just says you should try to maximize shareholder value. Well, how do we do that? Does that mean it's best to do it by squeezing your employees or engaging your employees? It doesn't give you any direction on that. However, it does give you some direction in terms of what the rules of the game are. And this is where accounting comes in, and especially financial accounting. The basic story is on the shareholder side, shareholders only see in public companies, but even in private ones, they only see information about the company from financial reporting. And financial reporting is governed by financial accounting. We have a problem, I think, an ideological problem, even in the academic world, much of the academic world, in that we are driven by an economics view, and I should say I'm at least a recovered economist. That's what my PhD was in thinking that the goal of profitability is what companies were about, and profitability requires operating efficiency. Therefore, companies are going to be efficient because they have to be profitable or they'll go out of business. This is the view that we still teach students, at least in introductory economics classes. Henry Ford's view of accounting here was a great one. He literally said this. Accounting's pretty simple. You just get all the money coming in, you put in a barrel. When you have to pay something, you take it out. What's left over is your profit, right? Unless you talk to an accountant, and they will tell you that that is absolutely not true. First of all, share price has very little to do with current profitability. Companies like Amazon and Tesla that never made any money had these incredibly high shareholder prices, right? So, companies and shareholder value is not about current profitability. That's just not the story. But the big story is, how do we understand what is profitability? And that is a very quirky thing. And this is where financial accounting comes in. You have the same arrangement in Europe with international standards for accounting, but those standards and the U.S. standards are not that different. The Security Exchange Commission in the U.S. is the government agency that sort of regulates this, but they've outsourced it to a private group. That group is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. You got the same thing in Europe. And that group is a private group. At least in the US, it's accountable to nobody except their board. But their goal is to maintain the integrity of accounting practices, and those are known as GAAP, the General Accepted Accounting Practices. It's just interesting to note that none of this was informed by business people. It's entirely created by accounting people, right? And their belief in FASB is that the goal is to maintain the integrity of this system. So let's talk just for a little bit about what this system is about and why it is contributing, and I would say causing, this terrible management we're seeing in the US. And why has it gotten worse over time? Because as shareholder value issues become more and more dominant, the attention to financial accounting becomes more and more important. And the quirkiness of financial accounting becomes more and more of a distortion. Financial accounting was created in a world where physical capital was what mattered, right? And in order to be an asset, that is something that has value in financial accounting, it has to be owned, right? And you may have followed in recent years the discovery that in plantations, financial accounting was pretty well developed. And the reason was slaves were assets because you owned them. On the other hand, employees cannot be assets because you do not own them. Even if they're under contract to you, they cannot be an asset. Now, you can immediately see the problem this is raising, and we'll get to this in a minute, if you look at companies like Google. Say, okay, what are Google's assets? Well, if you go to financial accountants, they will tell you, well, not much really. They own, some real estate and some hardware, but all their real value is their employees and the way they manage them. However, that has no value under financial accounting. And in the US, it's a little different in Europe now, but in the US, if you looked even at professional sports teams, right? and you said they trade for billions of dollars each, but financial accountants would look at those and say, they really have no value there. And why not? You know, people come to watch our players, and players are hugely valuable themselves. Accountants would say, no, they're not, because you don't own them. They have no value, right? All right, so why does that matter as a practical reason, explanation? Well, in financial accounting, you can make investments and you can depreciate them. You pay them off over time. With human assets, you cannot depreciate them. If you pay a lot of money to hire somebody in, you have to pay that all off the first year that they are there on your books. Say you give them a big bonus or something to come work for you, you have to pay off the whole thing this year. You can't pay it off over time. Depreciation also reminds you that assets need to be reinvested in to maintain themselves. You can't do any of that with employees. So training we talk about as an investment. In financial accounting, it's not an investment because you can only invest in assets. Employees are not assets. You can't invest in them, right? And that means training falls under the category of current and operating business expenses. That includes what you spend on coffee for your employees, right? So if an investor wanted to see your investments in spending on training, they couldn't even see it, right? And so training ends up not only not being an investment, it ends up looking like a waste of money to investors, right? And it's weird because employees are the only type of asset that could actually increase in value. But nevertheless, we see it as something that has no value in financial accounting. Now let's turn to obligations to employees. So back to the unlimited vacation trend, where did that come from? Where it came from was the typical model is that you earned vacation time by years of service. That meant that the employer owed that to you. And that meant on their financial books, those are liabilities. So vacation time is a liability that has to be offset in financial accounting by assets, right? Now, if you move to unlimited vacations, what happens is you drop that liability and instantly your company is more valuable. So why are these companies dropping vacation policies? Because they're dropping the liability from them. Why did they drop pension plans? The reason was it was dropping the liability on their financial accounting books. That's what drove it. It had nothing to do with what was sensible for business or sensible for employees. The final issue here, not a final, well, one of them, and this comes from economics, is the view that employees are a fixed cost that you can't get rid of. And that's the worst kind of cost for finance people, right? Because the belief that if the business turns down, you're stuck with these costs and oh my gosh, what are you going to do? Well, in Commonwealth countries where employment, it's easier to lay people off. And in the US where we have at will employment, which means that employers can always get rid of employees. It is bizarre to think that they're at fixed costs. We have layoffs all the time, and yet that's still the assumption in accounting. So the title of my book was Our Least Important Asset. The reason for that is US employers always used to say, people are our most important asset, and it became such a tagline that it was kind of a joke because everybody knew they didn't mean it. But the reality when you look at financial accounting is that people in employment are the worst cost, right? Because they see them as a fixed cost and employees are not assets, even if in reality they are all you got. So that's the title of the book. A couple more things on accounting, and that is, okay, so let's say you really wanted to play to investors, which is what most companies want to do these days. Here's what you would do. The first thing, another quirk of accounting, is that reports, financial reports on how a company's doing are often measured on a per employee basis. So what is your revenue per employee? What is your profit per employee, right? You can make that go up by cutting your employees. You say, well, isn't that about efficiency? No, because you're replacing them with leased employees. So we cut my regular employees, my real employees. I bring in contractors, but especially leased employees. My headcount drops by half. Suddenly my performance per employee skyrockets because I've cut the denominator. And this is something I only learned about. It's kind of embarrassing, this many years working in this topic, that corporations, but other employers as well, have something known in the US as headcount budgets. A headcount budget means this. If you are in a corporation and you go to your CFO and they want you to start a new operation, you say, okay, here's the budget we're going to need. They give it to you. They say, okay, here's $10 million, go do it. You would think the idea there is go be efficient, figure out how to run this new unit. But the CFO gives you a second constraint, and this is known as a headcount budget. The headcount budget is you got $10 million to spend, but you can only hire this many employees. And that number is always low, and the managers are given bonuses if they can keep that headcount number down. Even if it's more efficient to hire employees than, let's say, to go use leased employees or contractors. They're pushing you to go hire or engage, rather, contractors or leased employees or vendors and not hire employees. Why not? For all the reasons we just described above, right? There's lots of other explanations here that you can see about what's going on in financial accounting, but financial accounting is quirky, and it does not make sense in the way in which you think businesses ought to be operating when the value in them is human capital and not physical capital, right? So we start to see all kinds of ways in which companies operate that just do not make any business sense. For example, turnover costs, companies never see. They're not looking at it. They don't calculate it. They don't pay attention to it. One of my colleagues gave a talk recently to an HR group and just asked them, do you know what your turnover cost is? What it costs you if somebody leaves? Almost no one knew. And these were the human resource people. Well, if you don't think that turnover costs you anything, you got very little interest in managing people carefully if you're the CFO, right? And look at these astonishing statements. 40% of CFOs felt that unfilled vacancies had no effect on their business. How could that possibly be true? Why fill any position, right? And in fact, there's research in financial journals, financial economics, showing that unfilled vacancies hurt your return on assets going forward. How could they not? You have jobs that need to be done and you're leaving them vacant. Well, why do we do this? The CFOs think it's saving money, right? And one of my favorites here, the very last bullet, this was done by some of my Wharton colleagues who were really operations research people. They're engineers. And they were looking at the effectiveness and profitability of retail companies, Walmarts and places like that. One of the things they discovered was that the key issue for these companies is the last mile. You probably heard that expression in supply chains. The last mile in a retail store is getting things from the back of the store onto the shelves. That's the very last mile. And they discovered that most companies were terrible at doing this. Why did that matter? If things were not on the shelf, people didn't buy them, but they also walked out and went someplace else. So they calculated, they found that there were some companies that were really good at this. And the companies that were good at it made remarkably higher profit levels. And how did they do it? Well, guess what? They managed their employees better. They paid them better. They got better quality workers, and they trained them, right? And so they went, my colleagues, who remember engineers, right? They were talking to groups of CEOs about this and explained to them that profitability and retail profitability is pretty low, right? You could jump profitability up by 3% just by paying more to your frontline workers. And that included the cost of paying these people more. And the CEOs basically told them, get out of here. I mean, literally what they told me is, we don't need any Ivy League professors telling us to pay more, right? And these guys were just explaining, they're engineers, just explaining, look, here's what the data shows, right? They didn't want to hear it. Part of the reason they didn't want to hear it is it bumps up against the interests that financial accounting enforce to not pay people better. So what's the common theme here? And you can see it's shifting costs, really, away from paying people well and training, managing them carefully, onto turnover costs and productivity costs. We lose people because we're not paying them adequately, we're not training them, we're not developing them, they quit. Well, we don't see the quitting costs, but we do see the costs of training, right? So this is managing what you measure, and in this case, we are not doing a good job of that because we're not measuring the costs we're not seeing. Now, this is surprising. If you folks don't know about these groups, you should. There's a big one called the Human Capital Management Coalition. This is a group of investors. This particular one has $11 trillion behind them. And they have, in the US, been lobbying the Security Exchange Commission to require companies to report on their human capital practices. Now, you might think, whoa, this is this is really an example of ESG stuff, and they're really sustainable. That's not their interest at all. These are greedy people. They're trying to figure out how to make more money. Their problem is when they look at tech companies and companies where human capital are the asset, they can't value them. They can't figure out what the value as a tech startup is because all the value is human capital. They can't figure out anything about what those companies are worth. So their argument is really this. Look, we want you to report this stuff so we can make more money. It's got nothing to do with being nice to the employees. However, I am perfectly happy with that. Let them push to get companies and require them to report on these issues because it will reduce the distortions in the way companies are managing right now. Right? So there is some big muscle behind it. How far are they getting? Not very far yet. In case we thought that investors run everything, they have not been able to budge the Security Exchange Commission much at all. FASB, not at all. Financial Accounting Standard Board, they don't care at all what anybody else wants. They see they're like high priests in a temple. Their view is maintain the integrity of the golden tablets, which is GAAP. So they had no progress there. The Security Exchange Commission in 2020 required, I shouldn't say ask here, required companies to report on anything human capital that was material to their business. But here's why this is so irrelevant. They get to choose what to report. And so all they report basically are statements of values. They just say, we are deeply committed to the environment. We're committed to diversity and inclusion. It's just statements of virtue, basically. So nothing has come of that, right? But a little reporting would go a long way. And I think in particular, at least what I suggested, which is exactly what the investors want. Tell us your turnover numbers on employees, right? Tell us how much you're spending on non-employee labor, so we know whether you're efficient or you're just outsourcing workers. Tell us how much you're spending on training. If you just reported those three things, it would go a long way toward reducing some of the crazy distortions that we're seeing in the way companies manage. One more point, although as you could imagine from this account, the accounting story is the most obvious thing. But there's also been a big change, and this goes directly to your project on leadership and thriving, as to who the leaders are in the US anyway. And I think we're starting to see this, at least in the other Commonwealth countries too. Who are they? Well, here's a remarkable statistic, at least to me. 30% of CEOs, at least this is according to LinkedIn data, are engineers by training. Now, engineers could be wonderful people, but they're typically never taught anything about humans. And particularly, they don't learn anything about management. They think about people as an input, and they think about optimization, right? We've gotten rid of management development programs. So it used to be the great corporations, and that was a phrase that wasn't value-lated in the sense that they were good. They were just big. They all hired tons of engineers, training programs that sometimes went on for 2 years. And this is where they were teaching them about management, right? And that people were not widgets. This is the corporations used to teach that all the time, how to produce. And the reason they taught it is because it mattered. They could see that it mattered. Those programs are gone. I mean, they literally are gone. Almost nobody has any management development programs. So they're hiring engineers in who think like engineers, and they get no, real training, and often they don't get any experience. In the tech world is where you really see this now. So all the weird ideas you hear about management come from founders of companies that got incredibly wealthy. They were almost all engineers. or they were entrepreneurs with no prior experience. So you just go down the list of the big tech companies, the Googles, the Amazons. Jeff Bezos was not an engineer, but he was a finance guy, never run anything before. And that's where they get these crazy ideas from. You may remember for a while, Google had this idea, particularly this is for human resource people, that you ought to be interviewed by 15 people in the company and leadership before anyone was hired, right? And their HR people told them, you know, the evidence on interviews like this is it really doesn't predict anything. And the response apparently was, yes, but we are Google. And that was a way of saying, we're not just anybody. We can tell because we're so smart. So they did this study called Project Oxygen, and they looked to see, among other things, whether these interviews predicted anything. Guess what? They didn't predict anything, right? But the Google folks thought they were so smart that they intuitively knew about management. So you get a lot of that stuff going on. Data science has given it another big push because data science rests on optimization thinking, optimization programs. Maybe we could talk about that for a little bit in a minute here. And this whole thing ends up aligning with ideology. If it's not engineers running companies, it's people from financial backgrounds. Financial backgrounds, you know, finance people, finance majors and MBA programs, they don't learn much of anything about humans. And their thinking is very much around this economics view of profitability, right? That it means efficiency, and it just requires it. Now, a couple of other things that have changed, which are not well understood, is if we look at our leaders in the US anyway, but increasingly this is spreading to the Commonwealth countries for sure. And that is they're governed by contracts. If you look at a typical CEO's arrangement, they have a very thick contract that tells them how they are supposed to perform. They're employees, literally, but in practice, the contracts override that. And the contracts basically say, do this, get this, do this, get this. Can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. They manage CEOs by contract. CEOs in turn manage their direct reports the same way. So rather than an open-ended employment relationship, everything is looking more contractual, right? And let me see if I can just do a couple other things here, and then we'll wrap this up and talk about whatever you'd like to do. Here's the examples of how strange things have become. So if you look at lean production, and those of you who are in the field of management, when you hear the phrase lean, this is probably what you still think. It has been completely co-opted in the business world now. And just do a search after this program on the term lean, and you won't see anything about lean production anymore. It has been redefined to mean running with minimal waste and efficiency. So companies now are talking about running lean. This is what they mean. Lean production has sort of disappeared. The idea of empowering employees gone, but the phrase lives on. And look at Agile. Agile, you know, out of software project management approach where you empower frontline workers, that's gone as well. It's been completely co-opted. The term remains, and it just means flexibility now. And this is a real problem about Agile because Agile is killing people because Agile means continuous and constant restructuring. And all US companies now seem to believe their goal is to be agile, and that means constant restructuring. Restructuring is incredibly stressful on employees because it just means there's going to be tons of change. It's probably going to mean job loss, and we're not telling you yet what that's going to mean. So go back to work. Well, everybody just completely freaks out. Here's what is a little different now in the US, and this is kind of the problem that everybody would like to have. We went for 40 years in the US, as most Europe did too, and the UK, Commonwealth countries, with a bad job market for employees. Unemployment in the US fell below 4%, only 1 year in the previous 40 until 2018. And since then, it's been below 4% every year. So it has moved from something which was very much a buyer's market to something which is at least no longer quite the buyer's market, where it is hard to hire people and to keep them. Looking forward, what do we think? Is that going to continue? Probably. My bet is because productivity in the US went nowhere in the previous 10 years. If productivity is not growing and you want to grow as an organization or economy, you got to grow your workforce, right? You want to grow at 5% with no productivity increase, you got to grow workforce by 5%. Population growth is not doing that in the US. We don't have shrinking population, even though people think we do. Labor force is not shrinking. It's not growing that fast. So if you're looking out into the future, it's not looking like it's going to return to a buyer's market anytime soon, unless we have a crazy recession or something, right? So in response to a tight labor market and the likelihood that that's going to be the case going forward, what's the response? More downsizing and cost cutting. Why on earth would this possibly be the case? I mean, pick a company like Google, for example, right? Google had done a lot of hiring during the pandemic and afterwards, and they said the reason was we saw good talent, we were grabbing them because we know we're going to use them later on, human capital assets. The investor response was, don't do that. You're running fat. You need to lay off people and downsize. And so they did. Google had the most valuable human resource brand in the world. They were the #1 ranked company where young people said they wanted to work, even in countries where Google doesn't employ anybody. They spent a ton of money managing that brand, best place to work. They just put a bullet in that brand with these downsizings. Why do they do that? Well, because the investors wanted them to do it. And because they did not have a way of measuring the value of that brand. They weren't looking at it, right? It's unbelievably bad business, but there you go. And this process of constant restructuring and downsizing is burning out employees. Stress levels are up, all kinds of measures of this. There were 2 strikes in the US this past year that were amazing because of what they were about. These were in healthcare. CVS is a pharmaceutical company. The strikes, or the employee revolts, were demanding that the company fill standing vacancies. Just fill these jobs because you're burning us out. Why were they burning them out? Because they weren't filling them, because they were trying to save money. I mean, it's just kind of amazing, right? Let me just pause there. I mean, I could talk a little more about where I think this might go for human resources, and I'm leaving our meeting here to go talk to another group about this. These are HR people that, HR is the only place where they could advocate for change. And the way to advocate for the current business environment in the US is forget about values. Just say, this is stupid business practices. It's costing us a lot of money to manage poorly, to not pay attention to turnover costs. The CFOs don't care about that because it's not their game. Their game is managing to financial accounting, but the CEOs do care about it. The problem is they don't see any of the evidence for this. And this is largely a failure of human resources. They don't even surface the numbers to people in the company. So not a particularly happy story, but I think at least for my US audiences anyway, it is at least a cathartic story because now they understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. And for human resources in particular, it's just been extremely frustrating period. And for people who care about employees, it's been very frustrating. Economy's doing well, stock market booming, jobs getting worse and worse. Why is that? People wringing their hands about this, employers creating wellness programs which don't seem to be doing anything because the problems that are causing the stress are being caused by the employers themselves. Let me stop there, Antoinette, and turn it back to you. We can go in whatever direction you would like. Open it up for questions, I think is what you're planning, but I could also keep talking about anything else. I could tell you how weird it is to be in Orlando, in these cities created by corporations. Vegas is even weirder. So, but over to you.
No, first, I really want to thank you for this extremely powerful presentation. And I think it really was eye-opening. And that's something I at least never had on my list. And I mean, I'm also a human resource management professor who has worked together with a controlling professor who also didn't have it on his list, which I find particularly interesting. How I want to go about is a little bit that I want to create the burning platform even a little bit more, although I think you've done a perfect job in not going over the top, but really showing us it's also just bad business. But still, I would like to go a little bit more there, maybe go a little bit more into root cause, because I'm still amazed accountants being a profession, that they are not changing, and then about the solutions you were talking about. So if you just let me go a little bit more into the problem, into the burning platform, I was just wondering, when we are looking at the figures you were showing us, because they were really heartbreaking or staggering to me. Like, we are not doing anything on selection, training, career advancement. So my first question would be, what is this making with our organizations, our economy, and our society in the long run, if you look at that?
Yeah, what are the spillovers on this? Well, I mean, the most important spillover is health issues, most immediate ones, right? And interestingly, in Las Vegas, I was speaking at a conference of people who are all corporate people who study safety issues in the workplace. And they were pretty receptive to this issue that we are causing health problems for employees because they are one place where you can kind of see it, because they can see the employee health costs, which are paid by the employer.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are clearly mental health related. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is we're seeing stress-related health problems. And, you know, stress from the Whitehall studies in the UK in the 1960s on to the present, you can see how stress causes cardiac problems and a variety of other illnesses, right? High blood pressure, hypertension, all these things, right? Diabetes contributes to that. So it's a pretty clear path. The employers, I think, are not insensitive to that. And you see in the US lots and lots of big companies in particular creating wellness programs.
Yeah.
The problem is they don't improve wellness, right? And I mean, it's not my view. They're careful studies of wellness programs. They don't improve wellness. And the reason is, exactly as I think you're hinting, they don't get at the root cause. So what they offer you is counseling for the stress problems. They don't solve the stress problem in the first place, right? We're creating stress for you. Here's some therapy to deal with it. And the joke in the US is, here's another chair yoga class.
Yeah.
Yoga you can do sitting on a chair, right? So here's some more chair yoga. By the way, we're probably going to lay you off. You know, so that's the spillover, right? And it's a terrible spillover.
It's a terrible spillover, and also reminds me of the book of Jeffrey Pfeffer, you certainly know very well, Death by Paycheck, which of course comes through here very clearly. And if I think a little bit further, even if I go at the employee consequences, you were also mentioning other things. You were mentioning liquid workforce, outsourcing core HR services, surveillance technologies. I mean, you didn't use the word surveillance technology, but it's written in California Management Review about how AI can be used in different ways. Is there maybe then something additional we have to take on board, even beyond the mental health cost? I mean, there probably HR should worry. There is a person who's calling out surveillance capitalism. I mean, can we take it even further, or am I having too many fantasies here?
No, I think you're right. The problem on the data science side is that they are looking for solutions. They're looking for problems to a solution they already have. And the solution they have is the ability to capture data and measure things. So I'll give you an example of this, which is actually kind of hilarious. Lean production, you know, the Toyota system, but particularly the workforce aspect of that, is about empowering teams to figure out better ways. And it's basically turning teams into industrial engineers, right? You can look at the data to see where the problems are, see if you can fix them, etc. Well, there's a new generation of vendors who will do this with cameras and software. So they will watch the employees and see their hand movements on assembly lines, and they'll figure out ways to fix it and then tell the employees, you know, you must do this, you must do that. The obvious question, of course, that we would ask is, well, why do you need this if employees are doing it anyway? Well, because they think it's better. It's going to be even better. And so I asked one of the vendors who was developing one of these systems, I said, what do you think the employee response to this is going to be? And this guy, not surprising, is a data science guy. These are engineers.
Mhm.
So you can probably guess what his response was. He says, well, I think they'll probably like it because they'll realize that a company will be more successful and their jobs will be more secure. And so I asked him, "Yeah, you've never spoken to an employee, have you?" And he said, no, I haven't. Right. And that's what you're dealing with, right? There's a generation of these folks in data science. They're all engineers. They know nothing about management. They're cooking up solutions to problems, even when you don't need a solution to it.
Yeah.
But they're selling it to people in corporations who are themselves often engineers by training. And so we're right back to Theory X, right?
Yeah.
So all that 40, 50 years of evidence about Theory Y being superior just pushed aside. And what you're seeing instead is the rise of this again. So I wrote an article about this in the Harvard Business Review about 2 years ago, and I called it The Revenge of the Engineers, but the editors would not allow me to use it. So I don't know what I've even forgotten what the title they put on it, but it's really the revenge of engineers, right? I mean, they're now in power and they've got an audience. And people think data science is everything. And as you know, we think generative AI is everything and that it ought to replace people. And darn it, we're going to keep trying until we can get it to replace people. So
No. I mean, I'm with you, and it's interesting that AI science. I mean, we have colleagues in my business school as well. They are much more sensitive to ethical issues, but they say that doesn't even help because it's produced by technology companies, and technology companies or your vendors are, of course, interested not so much in ethics, but
yeah.
in the end, of course, creating new markets and earning a lot of money. So that's another one where I can see we should be worried. So yeah. So, but anyhow, I already found this. How stupid can you kind of be if I look at this figure demonstrations? Very, very convincing. But then I ask myself, as I already told you, I mean, I can see that accounting, and you put that very nicely, is a big part of that story. But I mean, accountants, I think, wanted to be a profession forever. So they have very strong struggle for profession. So professionals have ethics, and they would see that. So I'm also wondering, why are they clinging to this obviously non-good accounting practices?
Well, I think the answer there is not a good one, but it is powerful for them. And that is in accounting, they see the big priority, and they're probably right, is consistency and integrity. So the ability to compare companies on a, as we say, apples to apples basis, right? So identical. And so maintaining the integrity of the measures. And it's funny, my MBA students say they have often raised this question with their accounting faculty and say, why is it that accounting can't assess or doesn't try to assess human capital? I mean, my accounting faculty say, because we don't believe in slavery. Well, what they're really saying is that accounting does not allow us to do it.
Uh-huh.
And why does accounting not allow us to do it? Because it's not in accounting's interest to do that. That's not what they see as their job. Their job is to maintain the integrity of this gap system, which you can think of as something like common law. It's almost like
Yeah.
lawyers, right? It developed over time as a very useful way to allow these comparisons and to figure out what's going on inside companies. It's failing in an era of human capital.
Mhm.
But what do you want to do about that? Well, asking the people who run accounting to change accounting, is not going to work. That's why smartly the investors are not trying to talk to FASB and the people who create the accounting standards. They're trying to talk to the government people, the
Uh-huh.
Security Exchange Commission, who are political appointees, and trying to lean on them to get change to happen. They're not having much success, though, because there's so much resistance. There's even resistance from the companies, the corporations, because they don't want to report anything, because everything they report raises questions that they have to answer. So they
Yeah.
don't want to tell. I mean, so my view, and most people would probably say, if you're spending a lot on training, why don't you tell people that? And the reason my accounting colleagues tell me is they believe if I tell you what my training numbers are this year, you'll want to see them next year. And if they ever go down, I'll have to explain why, right? And so I don't want to reveal anything about them.
Yeah.
And the problem too is if I reveal them and nobody else does, it's not very useful, right? So this is a situation where individual solutions are just not going to work, right? Something has to be imposed from the top down.
Yeah.
And the question I think Audie raised, I saw in a little chat, what's the way forward? Well, the way forward, and this was pretty clear, it's political pressure and pressure from investors on government, which regulates the accountants to make them change. But it's also from within. The CEOs do care about operating efficiency, right? And they have to care about the long-term viability of
Exactly.
companies. I don't know if this was a story in Europe. It was a story in the US about Stellantis, the company that owns Fiat and Chrysler and all these other companies. And the analyst report was deeply critical of the CEO. And it said, there's a great line in it. It said, he's done such a good job cutting costs that the company can no longer make good cars, right? He's so powerfully
Yeah.
this model
Yeah.
that the company is making poor quality cars now, right? And CEOs have to think about that. Part of the problem is they never hear this story and they never see these measures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of that is an internal failing. Human resource people are afraid to raise them. They don't want to, lots of problems with human resources in the US, but the CEOs are not hearing the story. That's part
Yeah.
of
No, but it's very interesting. As I told you, I
it.
think my controlling colleagues are not so clear about that. Like I would have to go to my accounting colleagues. So even in academia, we maybe are too much in our silos. But let me go to the solution you were already saying. I don't know whether you know Colin Meyer, who tries to do something similar, of course, with natural resources. So here I would think maybe there's a chance here because he's thinking we need to make companies to show fair profit, which then really would have to be in their accounting measures. They would have to show if they are exploiting non-abundant natural resources, would have to put up reserves for restoring it. So is that the way to go? And would it also be clever then to link up with the sustainability movement rather than just do it for human capital?
I mean, it certainly wouldn't hurt, I think, but I think at least on the U.S. side, there's just not much interest in the corporate world, to be brutally honest, even in ESG stuff. It's mainly lip service to it. They want to look like they're doing the right thing. A few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, conference board issued the statement that shareholder value is no longer the most important thing for them, but it changed nothing about the way they operate, right? The investors are still hugely important. So, I mean, I think it won't hurt for sure, but I don't think it changes the behavior of companies really at all,
What he's saying, we're giving you
Yeah.
asylum in Europe. Although I'm not sure whether we're doing so much more, but at least
Yeah.
we are talking about natural capital. We're talking about not only having that in reports, because if you
Yeah.
just have reports, you can always say, well, that I'm not really interested in the reports. It's all about still the accounting and the profit. So
Yeah.
kind of bringing that together and thinking about what's the difference or what are the similarities between human and natural capital might give a little bit more power
Worth thinking about.
also.
Yeah.
But that's just one idea how to take that. I mean, I would also like to ask you, and I think you went there as well, what else could be done? I mean, do we need to have stronger unions again, or is that out of the books anyhow? Do we need better employee protection through regulation? Do we need to teach differently? I mean, Ghoshal told us a very long time ago. And now you're
Mhm.
saying we're doing, the engineers are also not better than the economists.
Mhm.
So where do you see more levers, and maybe also for us scholars, what can we
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, I think that's a a good question and maybe the right question, right? I mean, I think we can talk about the need for political change, but it's very important. But okay, what are we going to do about that, right? I think it has been a failing on the part of the academic community, at least, especially in the US. We, as you know, we just accept a lot more so than in Europe and even in the other Commonwealth countries. We just accept most of the parameters that are important. We have accepted the idea that shareholder value is what companies are going to do, right? And so um, we haven't thought very much about how you might change that and change the way companies operate. Except I think, the ESG approach was certainly the right thing to do and makes some sense. I don't think it's getting much traction, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's just an empirical observation. I don't think companies talk about this hardly at all, um, except for their PR people who do sort of talk about it. And I think the problem on the human resources side has long been, at least in the US, that it was a preserve of personnel psychology. And they were not so much interested in what the practices of the companies are. They were interested in the individual level outcomes. And the outcomes were pretty narrow. They were all psychological outcomes, right? And so we have ignored, the issues of health, for example, and I think this issue of agility is really worrying because agility implies constant restructuring. And I believe that the corporate leaders believe this is a paramount priority, that they have to learn to become agile, and agile means flexible. And flexibility means change, constant change, and change rips people apart, right? The uncertainty of it, and then the actual change processes themselves. So what could we do about this? Accepting that we're not going to change their minds about it. Right. What could you do about it? Well, here are just some simple things. This is very US focused though, right? One is this tone down the fake restructuring plans, and that is that companies announce lots of restructuring and even announce downsizings that they never do. But they announce them because they think the investor community wants to hear them. But the problem is if you announce a downsizing, you freak everybody out.
Yeah.
So our human resource colleagues say whenever a company talks about restructuring, the first thing that happens is they have a line out the door, even of executives who are saying, what's going to happen to me with this restructuring plan? And it turns out that the top of the house, they don't even intend to do it, but they're just saying it because they think investors want to hear it. And they're oblivious to the fact that it is completely ripping up people inside the organization, right? So that's a pretty simple thing to do. The internal labor market inside companies has largely vanished in the US. We moved in the late 90s toward, we got rid of the formal advancement tracks and the job ladders, and we used to call internal labor markets. Those are sort of gone. But we moved towards something which is quite interesting, bidding and posting systems, which meant that you just post a position inside the company, and then people can apply for it, and they can drive it. And that was quite interesting, but not well aware of the fact that companies began to pull that back after the Great Recession. People were not quitting. They put it in place in part to make it easier to find a new job rather than to have to leave the company to get a new job. That was the idea. When people stopped quitting, they started pulling that back and reducing the ability of employees to move internally. Why did they do that? Because the line managers hated it. If I'm a line manager and you're a good employee, and you move someplace else in the company, for my purposes, you might as well quit and go someplace else. So it was the priority of the local over the global, right? The priority of the local manager as opposed to the organization as a whole. So if we would allow people to move more internally, and this idea, which is an interesting one. I mean, most of these terms and things are fads in the US, never go anywhere, but the idea of a talent marketplace, which has, you hear that in Europe as well now, right? the idea that you could move internally, not just for a permanent job, but for temporary assignments where you could then learn different things, that helps. That empowers people a bit. And we know the most important thing in reducing uncertainty is to give people choice and control. So that would help a bit. Could we factor contractors into flexibility? And particularly there, the Shamrock models from the 1980s and the flexibility that was functional rather than numerical is something, at least in the US, we ignored. We are actually outsourcing core functions in the US, like IT. That is a $250 billion industry in the US, service management providers, where you're basically outsourcing your IT to somebody else. How about if we thought about outsourcing the things which are most variable? So that if the business has to restructure and go up and down, the vendors take the uncertainty, not the core of our business.
Yeah.
Why don't we think about that? And alternative organization structures means when there's a restructuring now in a company and it's sort of organized more traditionally, it ends up having these knock-on effects all the way around. If you have the Haier company in China, is I guess the classic example of this, of creating lots of little boxes. And that, we might have a particular organization structure around one big client. And if we lose that contract with the client, that whole structure, boop, goes away. And maybe you have to do something with those employees and the rest of the company, but it doesn't end up with all these knock-on effects in the rest of the organization, right? So, I mean, these are not radical, these are not value-based, these are simple, mechanistic practices that would at least reduce the consequences of this demand for agility, which I don't think we're going to be able to stop. I mean, it's already the number one or number two priority for CEOs in conference board surveys. So could we at very least give them ways to do this that won't rip the inside of the companies apart the way it is right now?
So it's interesting. This you try almost a paradox intervention here, but I think that's one clever way to go about it, because evidence obviously is not helping. I can remember that I'm not sure whether it was Kim Cameron or Robert Quinn, but one of them looked at downsizing and announcing downsizing, and that it wouldn't pay at all for companies. I mean, we do have very solid evidence on that, but it seems not to be interesting for that very little effect it has. So maybe a few more things, and you can just say whether that would be helpful or how you think about that. Is it in the end maybe also tied to how we pay CEOs? Is this something we have to change? Is it that we need to change the corporate form? So maybe we need to have more B Corps. Is maybe Gary Hamel right? That we have to crash bureaucracy? I'm just giving you some further things which are always broad in the field.
Yeah, I think the idea of paying CEOs differently is at least the most manageable one.
Yeah.
Right? At least that, it's pretty clear what could you do differently. And, CEOs do respond to that. And it's not bizarre that they do. You're telling them, we reward you for this. And it's not just the money, it is literally the board saying this is important.
Yeah.
And could you, for example, put wellness in there, employee wellness in there? Sure. And even if it's not a big number, if it's at least in their contract list, because as we know, you manage what you measure. And part of the problem that I guess I'm describing here is there's lots of costs we're just not measuring, like turnover costs, so we don't pay any attention to them. Could we at least get it on their radar screen that wellness, for example, matters? And that would be a simple one to do because I think broadly defined, it's hard to argue against wellness as something employers ought to care about because it does cost them money too, right? Could you put that in there? I think that's probably a very good idea and probably would matter and is maybe the simplest thing to do. Beyond that, and also because it fits in the model that they've already got, and that is we want people to behave, we pay them to do it. So we want CEOs to act differently, we pay them to do it. Why not? I think that's the beauty of a changing the accounting standards, right? Or required reporting requirements is once you see the number, then you pay attention to it.
Yeah.
If you never see the turnover number, they're ignoring
Yeah.
it, which is what's happening, right?
So, but I mean, I heard you, it's not so much about shareholder value, so insulating against that, like with B Corps, for instance, is that another option?
I don't think it's going to get far, at least in the US. They understand that the big money is to be made in public companies. Every little company wants to go public so that they can make big money. And, I just don't think, maybe put it this way, when we think about those options, we need to ask ourselves, who's the audience for that, right? Who are the people who are likely to be in a position to do something about it? And do you think we're going to have any leverage with them? And if you think the answer is no, when you think about that, then, you know,
Yes,
why are we doing it, right? Make us
sadly,
feel better, but
sadly, you might be right there. So maybe two more questions. One thing is just kind of a little bit hope to the people in the call, whether you see specific differences between what you have depicted is at present very strongly US, and if you compare that to European or Asian, African, South American countries, is there
yeah.
something where you would say cling to that and make sure you don't do it differently in the future?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, for all kinds of reasons, in Europe, more attention is paid to employees, and the accounting standards are more flexible in Europe. At least on certain dimensions, they do allow accounting for human capital.
Hmm.
One of the ones, interestingly, is professional sports, right?
Okay.
Because sports teams are traded like public companies. They do allow the calculation of human capital in professional sports. So it is a little window into which human capital might find its way in accounting in Europe, where the US, we haven't even gotten that far. Around the rest of the world, I think that here's the bad news. We spent a lot of time looking at companies in India, which we thought were quite differently run and certainly paid a lot of attention to employee issues, particularly issues of meaning for employees, engaging employees. They really took that quite seriously. But at the top of the house, as it were, the leadership positions, the US has disproportionate influence as a model.
Hmm.
And that is partly because we pay our executives way more than everybody else does. So if you are an executive in another country, you kind of like the,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
US model, because the closer you are to it, the more money you make, the more comparisons you draw with the US. Then you get close to their US compensation practices, and they like that. So the power at the top of the house finds it appealing to copy the US model. And I think, that's something that political power could resist, right? And I think that what it amounts to, I guess, is making public those efforts to do that. When compensation practices start to look more US based, when things start looking more
Yeah.
contractual with the CEOs, to be able to say, why are you doing that? That does not look like something that makes sense for us here. Why are you doing that? Now, we know why they're doing it, because they'll make a lot more money, right? But does that make sense? I think in the US, that still matters a bit, but not enough to stop anybody.
Um,
They're still embarrassed about the size of their paychecks a little bit, but less and less every year.
yeah.
But I think, public pressure does matter
Can.
more, I think, in Europe. Matters a little bit here, but not that much.
Well, it's interesting. I've been to several boards recently talking about CEO pay, and the boards wanted to have somewhat more reasonable pay, but then you have US proxy voters, and
Yeah.
we decided to have say on pay. So, and that of course gives them the lever, and then you're in the same problems again.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's
Yeah.
interesting. You really would have to look at all these different levels We even have
Yeah.
created to change it. So, but anyway, I mean, that's
Yeah.
a long discussion. I think I would, because I know you have to run, I would go with one last question. And this is just if from all what you have seen in your long career, and assuming you're probably quite frustrated with lack of progress right now, what is the one thing you would change today to make progress if you had a magic wand?
Oh, pretty simple. I would ask the SEC to act on these proposals
Yeah.
to require US companies to report on human capital. I think that would change a lot of things very quickly.
So I don't have good contacts to any sorcerer, but if I find some, then I'm going to send you the magic wand for sure.
No, there is a little bit of a magic wand on this. You could encourage people. This SEC has this proposal that is presented to them from the investors out for public comment.
Oh, good. Okay.
And, you know, the more people who comment on it and think it's a good idea, probably the better. I can guarantee you that there's lots of business people opposing it. So, you know, fortunately, the investor community is behind it. So maybe the accountants probably oppose it and the corporations oppose it, but maybe the investor community, it's interesting battle within the business community, right? We think the investors are all powerful. I hope in this case they are.
Yeah, well, as you say, if they, for once, even if it's for petty reasons on the right side, then we should go with that. I can completely see that,
Wish
a
'em
little
luck.
bit more political saviness. So, Otto, you also want to say goodbye because
And
There.
thanks for getting up so early in the morning.
No.
Nilsson. I mean, it was
Wasn't
much
that
appreciated, and what a brilliant talk. So thanks a lot.
it was
Good, my
perfect,
pleasure.
and we're going to make sure that this is watched by many, many, many people, and that
We have a new title, which is kind of Revenge of the Engineers. And that's going to be the title of the session.